All right, a question that I've probably been sitting on for a couple weeks now really relates to probably a question that people are expecting me to relay special, secret information as it relates to NFL players having particular injuries. So obviously that's never going to happen. So you can ask anything you want. It doesn't mean I'm ever going to answer it. At least in the way that you think I'm going to answer. So that the social media is not the place for those types of things. Aside from the fact that as a healthcare provider, disclosing information is beyond anything remotely acceptable. That's for other people to do and feel good about. Hamstring injuries in NFL wide receivers. That's a very, very good question. The NFL has dedicated millions of dollars from the combine that did not happen live. I think 2 years ago, dissemination of multiple different angles of research was presented, funded by the NFL, access to whatever data that was able to be attributed to NFL athletes. We talk about wide receivers a lot. I don't think that is inclusive of this group of individuals that seem to have these injuries. And that's the first thing we'll talk about. I'm coming at this from a fan's standpoint. You're coming at this likely as a fan's standpoint. There's only, maybe 100 human beings that are beyond that level that have the type of data, and assuming they have the knowledge breadth to be able to integrate and interpret that data, we're always going to seem to remember the ones that make the most emotional connection. So when you talk about the best players on the field, you talk about the ones that seem to make the most impact on our emotion as fans. It's not only wide receivers, it's cornerbacks, it's running backs, it's quarterbacks. It's often the fastest players on the field because they're the ones involved in making the biggest plays, the plays that seem to have the most indelible impact on our memory. That being said, I do think fast and explosive players are really going to be the target that we see these muscle injuries happening across all sports. I have gone through quite an evolution in learning the game of global football, soccer, where I didn't understand why the most explosive, the most fun players to watch, the most athletic goal scorers, they didn't even play the whole game. They would come in the second half, or they would come out. And, if he plays the whole game, he'll tear his hamstring. And I didn't understand exactly what that meant as the years went on. A lot of other things like offsides in soccer is not exactly like offsides in hockey. It's fast players, it's explosive players, and I don't think it's isolated to any one sport. Football is interesting. American football is interesting because you do have some players on the field who can be great at what they do and not necessarily have that degree of explosiveness in terms of what we see for guys that play outside the box. And certainly basketball, you're going to see it in some places in tennis. You're going to see it across the board, and then in other places you won't see it at all. And it's not only the inherent measurables that relate to speed and explosiveness, but it's also what makes that human being who they are, both socially and how they prepare to do what they do well. So we'll probably break this up into a couple different parts just because there's probably 3 sections to this parable that we'll talk about as to what is contributing to these hamstring or muscle injuries. And we'll talk about why it's the hamstring, but it's really can be any muscle anywhere in the body that fits this narrative. But also, I'm not exactly sure that there's anything we can really do about it to eradicate these types of things. I'm not sure that's possible. So I think that we can be better and always get better. Once you get to one level, then you move to another level. But to go from where we're at now to abolishment and complete understanding, I'm not sure we can actually do that. And that's kind of where we'll take this story, probably in 3 parts. So let's talk about the research and what do we know in terms of this population. Also, what what don't we know? I don't know. I'd have to go back and look if it was relayed on what positions of an NFL or an American football team were being studied here. We're going to assume that we care the most about these explosive players, the ones that are most emotional. I think it's also important to recognize that if they're getting paid a lot, we probably should be paying more attention to the insurance policies of training and preparation, etc. I don't think that really happens too often. I know if you have two cars in your driveway, one's a Ferrari and one's a Chevy Cruze, you're probably paying more on insurance for the Ferrari. So I don't remember that, but that matters. That matters who you're talking about when you start to unravel why maybe the same injury might have happened to two different people. There might be completely different reasons. So in that information, everything kind of got distilled from the physical piece as to two modifiable factors, two things that we found were associated with individuals that had these injuries, and things that we could actually do something about. There's a broader list of all the attributable factors, but they're not all modifiable. Two things that were modifiable. And number one was basically the length of the muscle. Okay, so there's our green muscle, because this is the Incredible Hulk, and we want length. Okay, how you measure that length, active versus passive, different positions, remains to be seen on how that type of information would further complicate the data set. We don't know that. The other thing that is a modifiable factor is strength eccentrically. Okay, so now when you talk about American football and you talk about these guys that play outside the box, you have sprinting, which is the primary incidence of where you see these types of problems. So now, remember, muscles are going to tear when they get here, and then they tear. They don't necessarily tear when they're getting shorter, even though anything is possible. You can disrupt the muscle. Not sure you can tear it in half by when something gets smaller. Also important to think about. So now, as you get eccentrically strong, you have the factors of sprinting, putting more force into the ground, and stride length. Like these are putting more force in the ground is the all sorts of mechanics, etc. But mechanics then clouds these modifiable factors of length and eccentric strength. But as the hamstring is at its longest, as you are in this stride phase, and before you reach the ground on that phasic side, that's when the hamstring is longest, but that is when you are attempting to decelerate the hamstring, and that's where eccentric strength becomes very, very important. We're not going to dismiss those things, but at the end of the day, it can't just be these two things. That's impossible. I think it's very easy when we look at snapshots of science, meaning it is not debatable whether these are true or not. They just might not always tell the whole story. I think we can find another very reductionist statement that can be applied to any tissue in the body that fails in terms of let's just keep it compacted to muscle. If a muscle fails, well, then we're going to say this highly reductionist statement that, well, its loading exceeded its capacity. There's a lot of lines that can be drawn off of the words loading and capacity. So if we just do these two things, I think we have a good opportunity to improve something. But it can't just be these two things, because you could take there is somebody that has the best length. Again, I am not familiar if there's a commentary on too much length. Do you have a 4 on your active straight leg raise? That probably could be an issue. And we've certainly seen gymnasts and other athletes have well beyond 90 degrees, well beyond 100 degrees of active straight leg raise. Who measured the best, and how are you going to measure it? And that comes into the first little wrinkle into this. Nordboard, brilliant. And in my opinion, I don't care what form you use when you are testing the Nordboard. I would not train with that heavy lumbar extension that we often see. It gets talked about on social media. I would put that into the category that I don't get it. But from a testing standpoint, I don't even care. You could do whatever you want, because the goal is to simply use this objective information from this very repeatable and likely safe measure to see, do we have this, because of course the hamstrings are the primary driver of the control of using the Nord board, looking at glute ham raise, Nordic hamstrings, all the different variations. I think we should be training them here. So now if you looked at something like that, would we then have a different opinion on the exhibition of eccentric strength? So I think that's important, and it's not only relegated to the lumbar spine. When we look at other forms of eccentric hamstring strength, with or without length, irrelevant for this mini conversation, what about your ankle? What about tibial rotation? What about the hip? What about the pelvis? What about the SI joint? It's this dance between the nature of the direction of the collagenous tubules and mobility and stability. When we just say that capacity was outrun by the load, there's so much more that really has to go into that. Now the problem, and I think, and I always take my opportunity to get these in, of course, when you hear a popular commentary on, okay, well, I tell you, it's easy why the tissue failed. Well, because its loading exceeded its capacity, and that takes you to a series of exercises. Anything can work for anybody, but not everything works for everybody. You can make a comment, and I've actually said this, it was in a podcast a couple years ago, where an individual was correctly commenting on the value of subtalar mobility in ACL injuries. And I said, I don't really care what your subtalar joint is, because if I have you deep squatting, well below 90 degrees, active, you're not dropping into the bottom, you're not dive bombing into the bottom, the evidence has shown that the ACL of Olympic lifters that are doing that looks like this instead of like that. An ACL that's is just genuinely thicker is going to be able to tolerate more load, and you have now broadened that gap of when subtalar motion could be a problem, but the ligament doesn't break. So there's always is going to be a solution of a more robust collagenous direction that can become part of the solution. That being said, I could say the other thing, where no matter how dense the ligament or the muscle tissue is from a stiffness standpoint, if your joints are far limited versus the movements that you can accelerate into, well then that doesn't matter. And then mobility and stability does become, motor skill acquisition does become more of a limiting factor. That actually can be studied. Unfortunately, how are we truly going to measure stiffness of conjoining tissues? That's obviously a medical, in most situations, not all, that is going to be a medical level of measurement, and one that is simply not acceptable. Biopsy, creating this type of injury in team sports. Even if you do it the day after the Super Bowl, that's not, why would you injure someone just to learn something that can be modified with some of at least the things that we know. So there's a lot of different pieces that can go into that puzzle, but I did use the word stiffness towards the end. And the reason I use the word stiffness is that we move into the next part of this discussion. Stiffness is what makes those superstars who they are. It's not necessarily strength of the muscle. That's what they found. But remember, when they're measuring strength, they're really actually measuring force. Okay? So as we move into the second part, we'll distill that component to understanding why fast and explosive athletes seem to have lots of muscle injuries in their sport performance. You have a good opportunity to create a very, very dramatic effect that can lock in and allow you to throw something real big over your head. All right, now, when we talk about the word stiffness, By definition, it's a term that's in physics and refers to, at least as it relates to the human body. This is what Shirley Sarman was talking about years ago in the first 6 chapters of her book, where she found she would kind of distill her message that the joint system that was moving too much was really the problem. She would put you into a position and create repeated motions that would, in theory, create a stiffness in that area by loading into that area. I think there's, just like anything that was old, there's a lot of other things that can be utilized as a companion to those thought processes. That being said, stiffness is the answer. In terms of, if I take a rubber band, if I take a Perform Better yellow mini band, most people can pull it very, very easily. Keep in mind that when you take the blue or the black Perform Better mini band, you have to use much more force. At the end of the day, those 2 bands have the exact same length. Okay, so it really challenges this whole notion of even not only how you're measuring length in different positions, but length and stiffness are 2 different things. All those bands, when they come out of the factory, are all the exact same length. But a black band or a blue band has a lot more of whatever is made out of when it comes to these desirable components. In this situation of muscle, we'll get to tendon and bone. What are those organic substances? There's more of those. There's more collagen, there's more elastin, there's more reticulin, and in different percentages in the black band that is very, very hard to pull. So stiffness just says that it requires more force to achieve the same length. Now, we should be careful in using the word stiffness when talking to an undereducated or a miseducated client or patient, because I don't think most people, particularly ones in pain, are going to receive well from a biopsychosocial aspect. Oh, we need to make your spine more stiff. I don't think they're going to respond well to that. But it's a term in physics. Everything on Earth has a degree of stiffness. It is about the stress-strain curve. How much force I can put into this substance where nothing happens, and then something does happen, but as soon as you remove the force, it immediately comes back. That is an elastic phase. How about I put enough force for enough load or for enough time, and it stays that way? That is a plastic phase. Or how about when I put enough force for a long enough time, all of a sudden the tissue fails or the substance fails? That's the stress-strain curve that we are very interested in here, and it goes like this. So from here to here is the toe phase, nothing happens, and I'm going to be really, really gross and rudimentary with this. So now I put force into the product, into the substance, and nothing happens. I'm going to put enough force and time here. This is called elastic phase. So I take that yellow rubber band, I pull it, and then when I let go, it comes back to exactly where it was, even though it might not actually be exactly, because now heat comes into the equation, which we will discuss briefly, which will likely challenge these thought processes of stiffness and that everything is just a load capacity issue. Probably far, far more reduced than it needs to be. Now, the plastic phase is I pull on that rubber band, and it's a unique rubber band. It's not that yellow one. I hold it there, I hold it there, I hold it there, and now it doesn't land back where it was. It's a little bit perceived as longer because we have broken some of whatever this substance was made out of, so now it doesn't have the same stiffness. That is the plastic phase. Plastic, very poorly written, but I told you here. And then the failure. So now I hold it there long enough and it breaks. So that's the stress-strain curve. You can put that stress-strain curve under a multitude of environments. I just mentioned heat, because if I keep pulling it or if I hold it there, there's kinetic energy being built up. Energy is a form of heat. So this can change. If I take a piece of metal, like there's basically the toe phase and the plastic phase are the same, but then if I put a blowtorch under it, I can put very, very little force. So it can't just be what this one thing is as it relates to stiffness. As we talk about things like heat. So the body is warmed up. That's why increased tissue temperature is a crucial part of a good warm-up. So we might change stiffness. We also know that some people don't like to warm up. And now we're I hope that we're finding some answers of what makes different activities different, but more importantly, what makes different people different. Because I think the biggest difference as to why you see these hamstring injuries in American football is simply because it only happens in certain individuals. You have heat, you have fatigue, which we will get, I think is something that is not part of the research that I was reading and familiar with in presentations. What else can we talk about? I think these two are crucial. Obviously, hydration. The performance of the contractile elements will absolutely have a part in that silly comment that the tissue will exceed its capacity. So if there's hydration that's optimal, certainly hydration too much or too little can be a problem. And then of course, nutrition. Anytime you talk about hydration, nutrition, and everything that goes along with driving those substances such as sleep and psychology, okay? So now when we look at the stiffness, if we profile, remember I said in the beginning, we didn't know who these individuals were, okay? But now if we look at this, and here is a tendon, and here is a tendon, those individuals are all going to have two things. Almost every single one. I would probably venture to say everyone. Of course, that's my opinion. That's all this is here. It's just my interpretation of what we think we know. So these tendons have very, very naturally different percentages of those things we mentioned before: collagen, elastin, reticulin, ground substance, lots of other things. These tendons are stiffer than the muscle. That is a hallmark sign of all forms of performance. No matter how much force you can create or tolerate eccentrically through the muscle, if the tendon is less stiff than the muscle, then you cannot move this substance. It's not possible. We have a video that was answering a different question as to why Achilles tear, and again, of course, it was totally, when the person DM'd me the question, it had the athlete's name and why did so-and-so tear their Achilles, and I did have information on that, but I, of course, am not going to share it. I think these were a huge part of it, by the way, in that particular situation. But you have to scroll down, and there's a picture of me. I think I'm wearing a Pittsburgh Pirates strength and conditioning shirt, courtesy of Jim Malone, and I'm sitting on the box. And then we used the sled because the sled was the bone. The bands, and we showed the difference between tendon stiffness, and then I'm the muscle, okay? And we started to see that if you had a yellow band, a really weak band, you can't move the sled. But if you put a very, very stiff band, you can move it really, really fast, and then everything in between. I'd like to give you an example. When I lived in Philly, the gym that I went to, one of the best gyms in the country, which is Steve Pulcinella's Iron Sport Gym in Glen Olden. Always been very, very lucky that I've been able to have gyms. Even growing up in Toms River, the Bally's in Bricktown, New Jersey, a Bally's Total Fitness, chalk, 100-pound wheels. You could train hard. Titan Gym in Georgia, which was all disciples from Opelika and Auburn. Adirondack Barbell in the different locations there with Bill Crawford. Always very, very lucky to have big time gyms to where you could really, really get after it. I bring up Steve Pulcinella because he's one of the earliest, most well-known American World's Strongest Man competitors. When you were staying up at 1 a.m. in the morning and you watched these guys pull airplanes, Steve Pulcinella was probably one of them. So think of this enormous 6'3", 6'4", 300 plus pound individual, and he's strapped up to a harness, and then there's a rope, and the rope is attached to a giant airplane. Again, this is one of the strongest human beings on earth, and it will demonstrate these components of understanding stiffness. Because if at any point, regardless of how Steve applied force through the muscle and physics of ground reaction, if the rope or where the rope attached to the harness, or where the rope attached to the plane, if any of those things broke, the plane doesn't move. So the stiffness of the connection of the rope, the stiffness of the connection to the airplane, all of those have to be more stiff than what Steve is creating in terms of force into the ground. Otherwise, it doesn't move. Otherwise, he keeps pulling and pulling and pulling. Okay. Now, I think that's just general physics of three different substances: muscle, tendon, and bone, that have different levels of stiffness. If the bone had the least amount of stiffness, Steve would pull, the connection to his harness would stay, the rope would stay, but it would pull off of the plane. That would create somewhat of an avulsion fracture, if you will. I recently just saw them too in the lateral foot. Very important to diagnose and not diagnose it as an ankle sprain. So that's very, very important. Now, every act of human performance is governed by those rules of stiffness when there's connections of different tissues or different components. Now, the other thing that makes those wide receivers really, really good, because they're not moving airplanes, they're moving a body weight. So you have an opportunity to move with much, much higher acceleration when it's your own body versus pulling an airplane. For instance, if you were even just going to pull a heavy sled and you tried to get out at just as fast as you would be if you were doing a sprint, you would not, the thing would never move. You cannot move fast when something is very, very heavy. You can move as fast as you can, but it cannot be that fast because the system just doesn't react that way. What you would think, you would see, you'd be holding on to the rope and pull the plane behind you, and you'd slowly start to create force and friction into the ground, and all of a sudden things would start to move, and then you can go. Object in motion tends to stay in motion, object at rest tends to stay at rest. When you look at these individuals that are the fastest and have the highest vertical on Earth, they're moving their body weight. They may not be that good of a force producer when you put big wheels on their back or other types of force. They might only really be good in that 0 to 20% ballistic. They might only be good in that 20 to 50 speed strength. Their force production may go down when they get into these other areas because it's what makes them unique. It's why they can run a 4.32 40, or it's why they have a 40-inch vertical jump, because they're really, really good, and that quality is rate of force development. Okay, so you need tendon stiffness and you need rate of force development. Those two things are, in my mind, at least in my experience, these are the guys that get injured with muscles, because they don't need a lot of collagen tissue that you can only develop through slow strength training, okay? They always train really, really fast. And now there's a whole social component to that here that makes this really very, very interesting. They hate training slow fast because it's not how they're wired. I always would have thought a big evolution also for me in coaching performance in the game of basketball. I always would have thought that if a player said that lifting screwed up their shot, that I thought they were full of it, and I was totally wrong. Lou Williams, the greatest six man to ever play, I had him when he was a rookie when I was still in Philly. And this dude's wired, okay, probably high 30s, if not bigger, vertical jump. And this individual would have to demonstrate these two things. And one day he comes in and he says, I know with the rookies we're going to lift in the morning, but man, it really messes with my shot. And because he was so respectful, he was always very good to me and really enjoyed his company. I'm like, yeah, no problem. You train in after practice with the vets, no big deal. So I had no idea about DC potential, but I also had no idea as to maybe why that DC potential was being triggered outside of our optimal range for a skill, was because I was putting him in situations that was so far outside of his neural his neural sweet spot, not a scientific term, because I wanted him to gain weight. I wanted him to get bigger. He actually, I remember at the end of the season, he finished the season at 185. I don't know if that's really where he played the rest of his career, but I know he gained 20 pounds throughout the year. Didn't play a whole lot, so he was able to learn to train and eat like a grown man. That being said, those players hate to train in a way that increases stiffness here. Now here's the other thing. When you increase stiffness here with really strong 5x5, you break these little links right here, where the muscle meets the tendon, and here, where the tendon attaches to the bone. You'll break those cross links a little bit when you train slow, strong. So now, is it possible that when you now break up the connection of the rope to the harness, not the actual tendon, not the rope, but then you break up where the rope attaches to the plane, you probably don't get out as quickly because some of the force is being dispersed through those junctions, and all of a sudden you don't cross the finish line as fast. Well, but you now traded that for the assumption of a healthier or a better risk profile for a muscle injury. These guys hate to train that way because they don't feel good. Number two, they don't train that way because it's just, usually these are the best players on the team, and at the highest levels of sport, they're going to pull a little rank. And I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that if we understand what's going on here, because there's some other ways and how you manage the training process, doing maybe ordering some different things or different times of the year. All of those things come into play, but now if we understand physics and we understand what makes them who they are in the first place, we understand why they don't train that way, or just that they don't train that way because they pull rank. Now we see that I don't know that there's an easy answer. You know, everybody loves saying, "Oh, you can't study injuries or multifactorial," but we're getting there now because we're talking about things that were well beyond what the NFL's research presented. All of these things, and now understanding that if you don't train a certain way, you're not going to create a certain adaptation. And as we understand physics, where you have three different things: bone, tendon, muscle, and the stiffness profile of those three things that makes you really fast is the same profile that probably increases risk for a muscle injury. That's and it's still a moving target, because when these things come into play, heat, fatigue, hydration, nutrition, it'll change exactly how these different structures perform. So what do you do about it? Maybe that's what we'll go into in the next part. Because what you do about it, I'm not even sure is a guarantee you'll be able to decide if it's worth the squeeze. You have a good opportunity to create a very dramatic effect that can lock in and allow you to throw something real big over your head. Okay, so now what do we do about what we learned in terms of, what are the modifiable factors? What do we understand about stiffness and performance? Why certain training of what you're already good at might actually increase your injury profile? Well, you got two things that you can do. Number one, we can exactly do this. We can get after what we know. So let's talk about that first. What can we do to train length of the posterior chain, length of the hamstring, and eccentric strength? Well, the first thing that I would start to think of is kettlebell ballistics. Okay, and the more skill that you have in terms of handling double kettlebells, we can start to scan a little bit of that 20 to 50%, if not more. Getting into double kettlebell snatches. Do we have ideal shoulder mobility? What can we do to then regress and lateralize to those things? Because when you're in the hike, whether you have one kettlebell or two, you're moving relatively fast. So we're pandering a little bit and placating a little bit to that rate of force development, but you do have load. You do have load, and you do have the eccentric strength. You do have the length. So kettlebell ballistics could be a big answer. You've got the traditional RDL. Now, there is something called the Dimmel deadlift, which is basically taking advantage of this explosive hinge using less weight. It's basically a really fast rack pull, named after Matt Dimmel, a famous West Side barbell powerlifter many years ago. That being said, whether you put it to a rack or you're doing RDL, these are options. You can do RDLs really, really fast. You can do RDLs really, really slow. Eccentric strength in here. Getting RDLs really, really slow would probably be a pretty good bulletproof for hamstrings injuries in these individuals. I don't know if you take a 4-3-2 and make him into a 4-3-5, which is clearly going to be the difference of making a big play to win a big game. That can happen. That can happen. That's what makes this really an interesting topic and a very, very long topic, for at least for me to talk about. Some other options here, you can get into Olympic lifts that have a hang. So when you have the hang, you're getting the length and the eccentric load. And then what you do as you come out of the hang is up to you. Again, if we're going to try and go slower, just make it really, really heavy and let's just get a pull. If we feel like you want to get a high pull or catch the bar, of course, there's nothing wrong with those things, but now you're lowering the weight and you're probably getting closer to the very effective and popular velocity training model. Remember, velocity, you might actually set the machine, set the toy to give you the positive feedback when you're going slower. So you can train even in very, very high loads, because if you move the high loads as fast as you can, you're still moving slow enough to affect the collagen and the connective tissue in the muscle and start to balance this. I don't know the answer if everybody gets slower or how much slower or who you should do this to. Because remember, in the pro sport level, this isn't just give somebody a program and they do it. You'll be lucky if you have more players like that than not. That's not how this goes, and that's a whole nother topic, and it's a social discussion that I'm probably not willing to get into here. You guys get the point. So these are some options. I also think that Mike Boyle did this several years ago. I don't know if they're still doing it. Single leg Olympic lifts. I think is, and again, I don't care about catching. Most of the stuff that we're going to look at, in this case, it's a hang. We'll teach it off the box, so you're already in the power position, and then you just go off. So you are training a little bit more power and probably stiffening the tendons more. Okay, but who are we doing that for? Is it somebody that's running a 4-3-2 or somebody who's a lineman that doesn't even sprint more than a few times every couple games, much less, because this is about sprinting. If you don't sprint a lot, then you may have a different risk profile. There might be a different injury, because all of these concepts can apply to anywhere where a muscle pulls on a tendon that moves a bone. When the stiffness profile between those three substances is ideal for one thing, it may not be ideal for another thing. Everything has a cost. The last thing we can look at is having this robust monitoring of both internal and external load, and understanding every set and rep and everything that goes into the individual's body, so that when the individual does break down, or you start to see trends of when you think they're going to break down, you can modify the training program. So that can be done with external load in American football, but is the system set up to accommodate changes, particularly for a very important player who needs repetitions in working with other players? This is really where the complexity of injuries comes into place. I think off the top, just to say increase eccentric strength and length, and that's all that matters. Those are not the only modifiable factors. It's just the modifiable factors that live in the literature. Moving forward, understanding the connections of those three substances and what can we do to get as close to it, but then also bring together that social component of really what is important for getting this individual to get the best risk reward. I don't know those risk rewards. Maybe you do. Or maybe if you happen to be in the Crichton section of Mobile, Alabama, you're going to look for that leprechaun and you see him, say, yeah. You have a good opportunity to create a very, very dramatic effect that can lock in and allow you to throw something real big over your head.